All right, today we're going to dive into a really fascinating and sometimes pretty tricky concept from psychology. We're talking about the dark triad of personality traits.
You ever been in a relationship, with a friend, a coworker, a partner, where everything just seems perfect at first, but then slowly something starts to feel a little off? That amazing charm starts to feel kind of manipulative. The friendliness, you realize, is actually pretty self-centered. So what's really going on with that pattern? Well, psychology actually has a name for it, a framework to help us understand it, and it's called the Dark Triad. Now, the Dark Triad isn't just one single thing. Think of it more like a constellation of three separate but often overlapping traits. You've got narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. This whole idea was really put on the map by researchers back in 2002. Okay, I know what you're thinking. When you hear words like narcissism and psychopathy, your mind probably jumps straight to movie villains, right? To these really extreme, rare cases. But is that what we're really talking about here? Well, to be clear, a full-blown clinical diagnosis like narcissistic personality disorder, yeah, that's pretty rare. It only affects about 1 to 2% of the population. And that is the absolute key here. We are not talking about diagnosing people. What we're focusing on are what psychologists call subclinical traits. These are the milder, everyday versions of these behaviors that can show up in people we all know. So let's break this down a bit more. What are these three core traits that actually make up the triad? This table lays it out perfectly. First, you've got narcissism. At its core, that's a grandiose sense of self-importance, that real need for others to admire you. Then there's Machiavellianism. This is all about strategic manipulation, using deceit to get what you want. And finally, you have psychopathy, which is really defined by a pretty chilling lack of empathy and remorse.
So we've covered the what, but honestly, the why is just as interesting. Why do these traits even exist? Well, it helps to think of them as a kind of social strategy, and a pretty exploitative one at that.
I mean, it's a great question, isn't it? If these behaviors are so negative, so damaging to the people around them, why haven't they just, been filtered out by evolution? One interesting way to look at it comes from evolutionary psychology, this idea of the two wolves. The theory goes that humans evolved with the capacity for both. We have the wolf of love, that's our compassion, our ability to cooperate and build community, but we also have the wolf of hate, our capacity for aggression and callousness, which was, useful for competing against rival groups. The idea is that both of these wolves live inside us. And this is where the academic definition just hits the nail on the head. Researchers call the Dark Triad a short-term, agentic, exploitive social strategy. Let's translate that. Short-term means it's focused on winning right now. Agentic means it's all about the self. And exploitive, well, that means it comes at someone else's expense. Okay, so if this is their whole game plan, to exploit others for personal gain, how on earth do people with these traits manage to pull it off in modern society? How do they get away with it?
Well, there are a few big reasons. A huge one is that these tendencies are often wrapped up in this really charming, charismatic package. Privilege is another major factor, just being in a position where you don't have to think about your impact on others. And of course, things like wealth and status can create a buffer, insulating people from the normal consequences of their actions.
So with all that in mind, how can we deal with this? How do we navigate relationships with people who operate this way? It really all comes down to a few key things: awareness, boundaries, and self-care. I'd say the single biggest red flag to look out for is the underlying worldview. It's this tendency to see other people not as people, but as tools, as a means to an end, pawns on a chessboard to be moved around for their own benefit. And you really see this in action when you have a need of your own. The moment you bring a problem to them or need their support, that charming mask can just vanish, because suddenly you're not useful to them anymore. The supportive facade drops and you see what's really underneath. Here's another common tactic. They create fuzziness. They absolutely thrive in confusion, in ambiguity, because clarity is their worst enemy. Why? Because when things are clear, you can be held accountable. And that is the very last thing they want. Okay, so let's get practical. What can you actually do? First, awareness. Just start paying attention to the patterns and trust that gut feeling. Second, boundaries. And this starts inside you. You don't need their okay to decide you're not going to play their game anymore. Third, clarity. Be direct, be clear, and try to be non-emotional. It's the best way to cut through all that fuzz. And finally, self-care. Please recognize that these relationships are exhausting and you have to make time to recharge.
And that really leaves us with a final, really important question to think about in our own lives. How do we draw that line? Where does healthy, normal self-interest end, and where does harmful exploitation actually begin?